Welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Alexander Scott. I'm your host, and I'm recording this podcast for you from Southern California. For today's podcast, I met with LAP contributing editor Adrienne Pine to discuss her new issue of LAP titled Social Struggle in Neoliberal Central America that was recently released in November of 2022. Now, among the many great things about this issue, I think it provides not only a very interesting and thought-provoking analysis of neoliberalism in Central America, but it provides multiple insightful case studies of social movements on the ground confronting neoliberalism in Latin America. Adrienne Pine is a medical anthropologist and the author of Working Hard, Drinking Hard, On Violence and Survival in Honduras, published in 2008. And she is also the co-editor of the book Asylum for Sale with Siobhan McGurk, published in 2020. Now, let's get to the interview. Adrienne, welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Alex.
Glad to have you here. Now, just to start, this is a question I ask all of our participants, all of our interviewees. Can you provide our listeners with just a brief overview of the issue and how it came about?
Sure. This issue is social struggle in neoliberal Central America. Really, the topic is right there in the title, but a large part of what we wanted to do with this was to kind of update our theory and analysis from the decades of the 70s and 80s, when there was so much focus on the revolutionary social struggles throughout Central America, and look at, with the neoliberal turn, how not just the political economic structures in the countries and ideologies along with them have changed, but also how movements have responded to these different and increasing threats to sovereignty, to human rights, to labor rights, et cetera. And so what we were trying to do is retain that, all of that incredible work that has been done, across different fields, but with a grounding in ethnography, on social movements over the decades, and bring it into some real concrete current examples, to look at how social movements today are informed by movement strategies of the past, how they differ from them, how they're responding specifically to what we might consider neoliberal threats, the sort of really accelerated capitalism, accelerated militarized capitalism, imperialist capitalism represented by neoliberalism, and also how they're fighting against the ideological backlash that neoliberalism brings with it, the difficulty in talking in the revolutionary terms that came so easily to the parents and grandparents of people who are leading today's struggles. So that's what we're looking at overall, and finding, of course, as many analysts have looked at in the United States and elsewhere, that today's movements are up against the nonprofit industrial complex. They're up against all sorts of ideological as well as really intensified violent capitalist challenges to what they're trying to do.
I'm really excited by this issue. It's a really important and interesting topic, and I want to get into some of the main arguments and findings of your article specifically, and some of the general themes that emerge from the issue. But before we do that, I think it's important. We have previous episodes where we've talked about neoliberalism, but in case the listeners are unfamiliar with neoliberalism and neoliberalization as a process that was carried out in Central America, could we unpack that a little for the listeners? Like, what was neoliberalism and how was it carried out in Latin America?
I think that's such an important question, and thank you for holding me to the fire to define it. And I actually start out in the introduction to the special issue, defining it as well. And what I say is it's this term used to define a broad set of so-called austerity policies and the sort of hyper-individualist ideologies that accompany them that have been implemented over the past half century. I mean, we sometimes talk about it as Reaganomics or the Washington Consensus, and really has been led by international financial institutions that force countries to do it because it's a condition of their loans, so IMF, World Bank, et cetera. And forcing countries to carry out restructuring programs and trade agreements that are enforced in turn through violence, through militarization, through really imperialized militarization in the case of Central America, where we can talk about the United States Southcom having military bases throughout Honduras and in other areas as well, and increased cooperation and training of the military bodies there. So these policies have really created a form of capitalism that is unfettered by the regulations that could otherwise protect communities from harms at every level. So from labor abuses, environmental destruction, climate change, land grabs, forced migration, and all sorts of other harms that people experience in their bodies that are embodied as an illness and injury, in addition to the displacing and other harmful impacts that they have. But at the same time, neoliberalism, if it were an actual agent and not sort of a series of people implementing and institutions implementing policies, it's very clever because at the same time, it actively works to break down the kinds of collectivities that could resist it. So neoliberalism, at the same time that it is implementing trade agreements that destroy workers' rights, it's actively union busting. At the same time that it's working to gift lands that belong to indigenous people and Garifuna people in Honduras or indigenous people throughout Central America or wherever. It's sponsoring their assassinations, and it's weakening the kinds of protections that indigenous people have as universal rights, right? And so it's sort of coming. It's a violence, it's a form of capitalist violence that is coming at people and communities from all fronts. And it's making it harder and harder every time for communities to come together collectively and resist that violence, which is the only way they can do it. You can't resist neoliberalism as an individual.
Right. That was an excellent explanation of a lot of the central tenets of what neoliberalism is. Now, with that being said, how has neoliberalism and this process of neoliberalization, how has it produced different contexts, and how has it changed the environment, the socio-political environment for waging social movements in Central America?
In so many ways. I mean, I think one of the real tricks of neoliberalism was at the end of, a decade and a half of incredibly violent wars that were proxy wars really carried out by the United States in directly against communities that were fighting against against oligarchies and dictatorships, and trying to gain a level of justice, the FMLN, the Sandinistas, guerrilla movements in Guatemala. And the US responded to all of these with war, with the Contra War, with funding the war in the quote unquote civil war in El Salvador, with the genocide in Guatemala, with tremendous repression in Honduras. So at the end of these, you have these negotiated peace agreements, but they're not justice agreements. So you have the peace agreements implemented, which is basically the people aren't necessarily fighting the wars that the United States was funding anymore. The United States agrees to not fund these wars, and yet sort of the exchange that you get for that is that neoliberal policies are implemented in at least in the Northern Triangle in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So that starts the transformation of these countries from places where there previously, in different ways and in different moments, had been really serious efforts at land reform, at healthcare reform, at different reforms that would create more equitable and democratic societies. Instead, what you have is the imposition of policies that favor privatization and that change that limit agrarian reforms, that ensure that people are going to have to labor as a proletariat instead of peasants, instead of campesinos, or instead of finding their own way to be sort of have a dignified existence in Central America. So that, first of all, it displaces millions of people from their communities in that process. They then reconstitute in urban settings, reconstitute communities in much more greatly impoverished and unhealthy urban settings. And or they migrate to the United States, where, the precarity is also, we know about the precarity that migrants face in the United States and in Mexico. And so there's this tremendous shift of populational movement as a result of neoliberal policies, but also there's just an increased insecurity. And I think it's really important to define this term, because that term insecurity is one that has been used to justify the specific policies of neoliberalism that have to do with crime control and militarization, that then bring with them the excuse to impose more drastic economic measures. So that when the United States talks about insecurity, it means street violence, right? Or at least that's what it's using to define insecurity. And the solution to that was actually in the early 1990s was Rudy Giuliani coming through all of these countries as a consultant with Giuliani and Associates and teaching everybody how to do mano dura, like tough fist and zero tolerance policies, which really meant the criminalization of poverty, the criminalization of protest, the criminalization of the poor. And with the implementation of these policies, it makes it much easier for huge international and particularly US-based corporations to violate all sorts of human, labor, environmental rights, because everybody else is being criminalized. If we were going to be honest about insecurity, we would recognize that the US-led imposition of neoliberal policies in Central America is solely, well, not solely, but very largely responsible for the insecurity that Central Americans have, not at the hands of gangs, which is what we hear the most about, or corruption, which is a sort of vague term meant to mask the usurpation of democracy and democratic processes, but it's the insecurity of not having healthcare. It's the insecurity of not having land, of having your land stolen from you from hostile governments and hostile international corporations. It's the insecurity of not having a right to education or basic infrastructure, water. Those are the insecurities that result from neoliberalism. And then following that, you get the insecurity of violence, of course, from people who are suffering this violence already, which serves as a justification for the hostile implementation of greater neoliberal policies. So sorry, that was a long tangent, but I think part of what's an overview of what's been happening in Central America and the challenges that movements have when they come together to fight back against these are much greater. I mean, I think the imperial presence following the implementation of neoliberal policies has only strengthened throughout Central America compared with what it was in the 1970s, 1980s. This sort of quote unquote peace era of imperial growth is in many ways much more devastating than the era of war, or the era that we sort of recognize of wars of the 1970s, 80s in most recently in Central America. And that's one of the things I cite Berta Cáceres in an interview that she gave just a year before she was murdered, trying to protect her indigenous communities' land and water from an international corporation that was engaging in extractive capitalist processes facilitated by the US-supported coup d'etat in 2009. She was saying that the conditions today are actually much more hostile for organizers than they were in the 1980s, when there was outright war and in some cases genocide, which makes it all the more important for them to organize, basing their movement and actions in a clear analysis of the dangers of capitalism and imperialism, as opposed to falling into the traps, the linguistic traps of talking about violence and corruption absent an analysis of neoliberal violence.
Wow, there was a lot in that. Wow, yeah, you really hit really well on how neoliberalism as a political economic process also has this ideological project as well. Like you talked about Rudy Giuliani and the neoliberal broken windows, zero tolerance policing going down there, and how it creates this sort of circular sort of process, right, where the political economic conditions are creating crime and fueling inequality and violence. And then how does the state respond with that? With more violence, right, and control. So that relates a lot to the work I'm doing. I find that really fascinating. But you also touched upon the real problem of how these issues are represented in the United States. And you do a really good job of this in the introduction. There's a lot of really great things in the introduction, but there's one section that I was like, damn, this really hits it on the head, where you highlight how neoliberal discourse is promoted in mainstream U.S. media institutions, nonprofits, by politicians, and how they're really guilty of obfuscating the fundamental root causes of the social, political, environmental issues that are happening in Central America. So I'd like to hear you embellish on that a little more. You already started to, but I think that's a really important thing to highlight here.
Sure. Thank you for bringing it up. And I'm so glad you liked it. In the introduction, I use as a sort of case study the Biden administration's so-called root causes strategy, which is led by Vice President Kamala Harris, just as Biden led the migration strategy for the Obama White House in following the 2014 unaccompanied minor crisis, so-called unaccompanied minor crisis. And I break down that root causes strategy. Now, of course, what Kamala Harris, when she rolled that out, when was this, a year and a half ago? Well, in the first few months of the administration, she did her first big international trip. She went to Guatemala and Mexico, supposedly on the hunt for the root causes of undocumented migration to the United States. Of course, she already had the answers for her before she went. And this was where she very famously was asked in Guatemala City at a press conference with the president. She was asked, what message would you have to Central Americans thinking to come to the United States? And her response, of course, was, don't come. Basically, you're not welcome here, you will be deported. And what a thing to say to people who are fleeing, at the time, like narco dictatorships, who are fleeing violence. I mean, there's an international refugee law that gives the right to people to seek asylum, and that sort of brazen lack of humanity reflects the kind of person she was as Attorney General of California, really, if you think about it. But it was a clear message, right? So they're trying to present this root causes strategy where they analyze, well, what are the real reasons why Central Americans are coming to the United States, and they come up with poverty, violence, lack of climate adaptation, all these sort of vague things that in and of themselves, well, if you take them at face value, if you say, okay, poverty / lack of jobs, lack of jobs is a cause of violence, then understood as gang violence and similar forms of or drug violence, and then whatever the climate, like the solutions are going to be, which they are in the Kamala Harris strategy, are greater corporate investment in providing jobs and greater investment in the militarization of the Northern Triangle countries. But if you really look at, well, where is impoverishment coming from in all of these countries, there is a very direct line to United States interference, to US imperialist and capitalist interference in impoverishing, as a verb, people who would be doing much better were they not militarily and economically and politically occupied by the United States. So what they're offering is to bring in these massive corporations that can further exploit people, whose labor codes have been devastated by 20 years or actually 40 years at this point, of neoliberal policies that are pushing back the hard-won labor rights of Central American workers. And then instead of providing security in the form of ensuring that there are fair land regulations, ensuring that the basic human rights are being provided for in terms of healthcare, education, et cetera, water, land, housing. Instead of doing that, they're sending more military money. They're externalizing the work of the border agencies of the United States, so that you've got border patrols, training people in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, in Honduras. And so it's this intentional naivete, misrepresentation, really, of what the root causes are. What Kamala Harris and the White House describe when they call things root causes are really symptoms of U.S. imperialist policy in Latin America. And if they were to address those symptoms, if they were really creating a root causes strategy, instead of more massive development that's only going to profit U.S. corporations, both corporations that might provide jobs like Pepsi or some of the other massive investors in this root causes strategy, as well as military industrial complex corporations. If the United States were to just stop investing in militarization, if it were to provide loans without the kinds of conditions that force these governments to give up their sovereign right to determine how they want investment. Honduras has a right to determine if it wants investors who are going to violate labor and human rights of its workers or not. But the United States is saying that, no, it doesn't have that right. Currently, that's how, that's a debate going on in Honduras right now. And so in the intro, I'm sort of looking at that, at the tremendous hypocrisy of the United States government as continuously framing, with media complicity, this country, the United States, as a provider of human rights, as an exporter of democracy, as a country that is helping these poor childlike countries. It's classic colonial discourse, and it really needs to be broken down at every single step.
I completely agree. It's fundamentally absurd, like on its face. But I think you do a very good job of of at least introducing this more critical perspective to the readers. Now, the whole issue is fantastic, has lots of really great pieces looking at different contexts, case studies, but I want to discuss your article specifically, because I think your article was really fantastic in providing an example of these processes we've started to unpack here in this conversation. Now, you're looking at the case of psychiatric care in Honduras and understanding the madness of neoliberalism in the country, but using the case of the psychiatric hospitals. Now, I want to discuss the findings and argument of the piece, but before we do that, could you provide just a brief background on the political events in the country surrounding the 2008 coup against President Manuel Zelaya, as well as the subsequent emergence of what you call neoliberal fascism? I'm particularly fascinated by that topic and how you present it as neoliberal fascism. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, thank you so much. And it's good to provide that background first, because it's so necessary to understand the rest of what I end up talking about in that article. So in June 2009, the then president, Mel Zelaya, who was democratically elected and who was fundamentally a neoliberal. He had approved CAFTA, the Central American and Dominican Republic Free Trade Agreement, which was, of course, one of these big neoliberal agreements that favors corporations, the movement of corporations and finances across borders to the exclusion of human beings. And he had done a number of things that were very favorable to the Honduran elite. Yet, over the course of his presidency, he started shifting ever so slightly to the left, responding to the demands of organized movements, and even going so far as to create an economic alliance with Hugo Chavez, because he had offered the cheapest price for petroleum, because Honduras subsidizes its petroleum, and this was really, an important step for them to make things more affordable for Hondurans. And so this just created huge alarm bells for the far right wing in Honduras, and of course for the United States as well, which saw Hugo Chavez as the devil himself at the time, still does in a sense, and even long after his death. And so there really the straw that broke the camel's back for right-wing Hondurans and their allies in the United States was that Mel Zelaya had responded to a call from popular movements to hold a non-binding poll to see if people wanted to actually have a vote over whether there should be a popular there should be an assembly to rewrite the Constitution. The Constitution had been written in 1982 under dictatorship, and ensures a drastic inequity in politics and resources and all of that. So he had responded to allow this non-binding poll to happen. It was the day of that non-binding poll was supposed to happen that a School of the Americas a School of the Americas trained general in Honduras famously took Mel Zelaya out of his home in his pajamas and then flew him to a U.S. military base to refuel the plane for about half an hour inside Honduras, and then flew him out of the country, took the president out of the country and implemented a military dictatorship. And then, following that, so in 2009, there were elections. I'm putting in scare quotes here because they were boycotted by anybody who had opposed the coup. There was a massive movement that really appeared out of nowhere. It appeared to appear out of nowhere, opposing the coup. And yet the United States at every turn, and I especially want to signal Hillary Clinton as in her role in the State Department, supported this coup And so there were three major elections following that. Each one was riddled by violence and corruption and fraud. But the United States rubber stamped each one. And the main thrust of the coup was to ensure that neoliberal policies would be put into hyperdrive. Really, it was the privatization of everything. It was pushing back any minor reforms Zelaya had made. It was getting rid of any sort of land reforms that favored peasant communities. It was creating these new zones for special economic development called sedes that are basically micro colonies. That's an initiative led by Silicon Valley billionaires, where people, from the United States and elsewhere could oust people from their lands, particularly indigenous and campesino people, and set up colonies where they can, do whatever sort of nefarious business they want. So this sort of neoliberalism in hyperdrive that was enforced through the kind of violence that we have seen really only in fascism. And so it's this, what I call neoliberal fascism. And I write about this in an article in Public Anthropology, in the journal Public Anthropology in 2019, is really when neoliberalism ends up looking just like fascism. It doesn't necessarily have the same ideological roots. It doesn't necessarily, it's not professing the same things, but it's acting that way. We're talking about book burnings, about the militarization, sort of like hyper-nationalism, all of these things that we understand as the state acting in ways that appear fascist. This is basically what I'm referring to as neoliberal fascism. It sometimes aligns with ideological fascism, but doesn't necessarily. And especially in the last 8 years of the Honduran post-coup dictatorship under President Juan Orlando Hernandez, the country really went full force into what I call a narco dictatorship, a neoliberal fascist narco dictatorship. Today, Juan Orlando Hernandez, just days after after Xiomara Castro, the current president, who is married to Zelaya, who was ousted in 2009, days after that, the United States came in and extradited him as one of the major drug traffickers in Honduras. So there were 8 years where they knew that he was basically running the country as a narco state, and they lauded him as being their best ally in fighting against drug trafficking. And then all of a sudden they realized, as soon as he was not in anymore, okay, now he's our enemy, and so now he's in jail in New York. And so this is the background. It was just incredible violence, the targeted assassinations of countless people who stood up against this neoliberal violence, the privatization of everything, the destruction of collectivities, of unions, that forms the background of anything you're going to analyze in that period, the 2009 to this year, really to this January.
Excellent. So with that in mind, then, let's talk about psychiatric care and mental health in Honduras. What have been the specific effects of this background, like all this background, political, economic, neoliberal fascism, all this that's happening? What have been the effects of that on psychiatric care and mental health in the country?
Well, so a few things. One is that healthcare was slashed across the board with the neoliberal fascist dictatorships that, sort of the multiple regimes that followed the 2009 coup, and with the intent of privatizing healthcare. And of course, the US played a very important kind of technocratic role in this through USAID, through, sort of pushing privatization measures both into public and private hospitals. And so that reduced kind of access to healthcare and quality of healthcare across the board. Psychiatric care was already bad in Honduras. It was in fact famous for being bad. There have been reports in my article. I did this combing through every report I could find going back to the 1920s of Honduran psychiatric treatment. And there's no time when it's not abominable. So just to make clear, it's not solely neoliberalism that is responsible for this. That said, you've got several things going on. The coup, while it was like this politically horrifying event that displaced untold numbers of people, was also deeply traumatizing. And one of the things that I noticed when I was doing research, not in a mental hospital, but in Hospital Escuela, which is the primary teaching hospital in the country, back in 2014, I was, in a pediatric children's, in a pediatric ward where they were dealing with mental health, and the lead psychiatrist in the ward would talk to me all the time about, what we don't understand is there's been this leap in suicide attempts among 14-year-olds, and 15-year-olds, and even younger kids, and I don't know what could be causing it. And I'm looking at that, and it was around the same time that the unaccompanied minor crisis was happening. I mean, you have children who see no future. They're desperate. I mean, their future has been stolen from them by this US supported neoliberal fascist agenda that has taken away their education, it's taken away their land, it's taken away their possibilities for healthcare. There's a collective desperation that is, in fact, the embodiment of this political situation that then many years later, when I started researching directly with practitioners of mental health, both healthcare workers and people who work in security in the psychiatric hospitals and other jobs, what they said is they all agree that there was a huge increase in people manifesting symptoms of psychosis and other mental illnesses and desperately needing psychiatric care following the coup. And many times what they said is people would come into the regular main hospital with injuries from being beaten up by the police, but they weren't ready to be released once they were physically healed. They needed to go over to the mental hospital because they were so traumatized. So what this does is it increases the need for psychiatric treatment at the same time that the funding is being restricted. And so there are even fewer resources. There already wasn't enough, but now there's even fewer for a much greater population of people who desperately need some sort of mental health care. And at the same time, there's these hostile attacks on the union members themselves who are trying to organize both against the things that are going on in their facilities, but then also because they see the impacts very directly of the larger political processes happening. They're also out there on the streets protesting against the coup because they are feeling that in their everyday lives.
Wow, that's heavy. That's really heavy. But I'm fascinated by your study, the amount of field work and research into the history of psychiatric care in the country was really impressive. Thinking about those effects on ability to treat as well as rates of mental illness, what have been the ways in which psychiatric hospital workers have responded to this issue? How have they tried to organize themselves?
Well, one thing that I find interesting about the Psychiatric Hospital Workers Union, which is a wall-to-wall union, meaning it represents anybody who works in the hospital, it could be a psychiatrist or a janitor, is that unlike a lot of other unions in Honduras, it has taken an explicit anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist stance and has joined the confederation. There are 3 confederations union labor confederations in Honduras, three main ones. And it was an inaugural member of the CUT, which is the anti-imperialist labor confederation. The other two are much more closely affiliated with the AFL-CIO and the Solidarity Center, which does do some good work in solidarity with, sort of basic workers' rights, but never is going to stand up against U.S. imperialism or acknowledge it or recognize the role it plays. So what you see this organization doing, this union, so it's an inaugural founding member when the organization founded in the early 90s, directly in response to the first implementation of major neoliberal restructuring of the country. It has continuously held leadership positions in that confederation as well. So when its leadership is talking about what's going on for their patients, it's always tying it to the broader political economy. It's not just sort of trapped in a discourse that's about the shop floor. It's also about the coup. It's also about, U.S. imperialism and the impacts of privatization. It's also working in solidarity with other unions that came out with statements. It was very active in the fight for the freedom of the Cuban Five, for example. It's sort of thinking about the liberation of oppressed peoples in internationalist terms in a way that a lot of unions don't do necessarily. And so in taking this very intentionally confrontational stance against management and against the neoliberal logics by which there's only two psychiatric hospitals in Honduras, by which their two hospitals have been run. I think that this is one of those things where with social movements, it's so hard to measure victories in any sort of scientific way, because a lot of what they're doing is pushing back against greater damage, which doesn't necessarily clock as a victory when you're trying to figure out what they've done. But in constantly going out on strike and in constantly making statements about the harms that the dictatorship was doing toward their patients and toward them as workers, they didn't allow it to ever fly under the radar. It was in the news throughout the dictatorship, throughout the pandemic in particular, when these hospitals were very, very deeply hit. And I think that has been an effective strategy in that I do believe things would have been much worse if they hadn't been doing it. That said, two things: they are still fighting, even now with this new administration that campaigned on turning around everything that was destroyed during the dictatorship. The Xiomara Castro administration, which is of the Libre Party, which was formed out of the resistance movement to the coup and to the subsequent dictatorships in Honduras. These workers are still going out to protest. So they voted for the current president, and many of them, still believe in her and believe in the Libre Party, but they recognize that their role in protecting their patients and protecting themselves is against capitalism itself, and that no party is going to actively take their interests on. And that's where I find them really interesting, because they're balancing a bunch of different kind of political forces and strategizing within and amongst all of them. They're thinking about empire. They're thinking about a friendly government, but a government that nonetheless works in an international capitalist system and that is experiencing great pressure from the United States to continue privatizing healthcare, and a hostile military and police that, are still controlled by the same forces that they were controlled during the dictatorship, and that over the past 5 years, and this is one of the things that I write about, have actually occupied the psychiatric hospitals, because there's an increased population of people with criminal convictions who are being sent to psychiatric hospitals against the will of the admitting psychiatrists by judges in Honduras. So there's all these things going on, and And it's just been really impressive to me to get to know the union members and leaders who are trying to forge a way to fight against this with a really deep anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist analysis.
Yeah, that is a really, I had no idea that struggle was going on, but it's incredibly interesting.
I just want to say it was really so inspirational to read the incredible work by the other authors in this special issue. They're looking at very diverse struggles, even though most of our pieces are focused in Guatemala and Honduras. There's a diversity of strategies and struggles and topics that just really made me, I have to stop there because I'm sorry. I need to start, don't use that piece because I'm trying to think what I could say about the other authors. Well, what I'd like to say is I'm really happy at how, in the end, and this is a special issue that has taken longer than I would like to admit to really come to fruition. I think that each piece addresses really different aspects, really different kinds of movements and aspects of organizing today that bring in elements from the past, that bring in memories from the participants in today's movements, from past movement organizing, and that really end up, I think, bringing into focus the ways in which organizing under neoliberalism and against neoliberalism contrasts with organizing, maybe for decades ago. And I think that rich picture, for me, it was really fun to see all of these different movements and how in many ways they come together analytically, even though they're fighting over very different things and in very different places.
Excellent. I agree completely. This is an incredible issue. I encourage all of our listeners to, if you don't get a physical copy, at least go download a few of the PDFs at sage.com/Latin American Perspectives. It's an incredible issue. Thank you so much for meeting with me. It's been really fun and insightful, and hopefully we'll be in touch.
Okay, looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thank you, Adrienne. That is all the time we have for today, but thank you so much for listening in. Adrienne's new issue, Social Struggle in Neoliberal Central America, can be accessed through our website at latinamericanperspectives.com or through Sage Publishing. Check the show notes for information on how you can get in contact with myself, the journal, or Adrienne. And if you enjoy the show and you would like to receive updates about Latin American news, current events, and content from our journal, please don't forget to follow us on any or all of our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And be sure to listen in to our next episode. Hasta la próxima. Gracias.